Greetings from New York City and Columbia Business School Executive Education. My name is Scott Gardner, and I'm very happy to be with my friend, my colleague, Professor Rita McGrath, for today's webinar, Discovery-Driven Growth, an Idea Whose Time Has Come. But before I introduce Professor McGrath, I'd like to go over a few quick logistics for the webinar. If you'll see on your screen right now, a recording will be made available of the webinar. If you'd like to tweet about the webinar, please use our hashtag CBSExecEd. And finally, we encourage you to upload your questions to the Q&A box throughout the webinar, and we'll get to as many of those as possible in the last 10 minutes. Thank you. Rita, it's great to be with you today.
Delightful. Rita
is a professor at Columbia Business School. She has received the #1 Achievement Award in Strategy from the prestigious management rankings group Thinkers 50 and is consistently ranked in their top 10 of management thinkers. She has been recognized as one of the 25 smartest women on Twitter and one of the top 10 business professor thought leaders on Twitter and LinkedIn. She is also a regular speaker at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. And finally, she is the faculty director of 2 of our open enrollment executive education programs, Leading Strategic Growth and Change, which we've worked on many times together, and the Women in Leadership program, and our online program, Mastering Corporate Entrepreneurship. Rita, so great to be with you. I know how busy you are, and so I'm very happy that you could be with us today.
It's a pleasure. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. Shall we get started?
Go to it.
So I've worked with you for many years. I've been with you in classrooms. I've been with you with clients. I've read, your articles, your books. One of the things is the truth is that every company promotes innovation, or should promote innovation, but many are finding that their attempts, sadly, have a low success rate. And you, in your work, have observed 5 common challenges that they face. Shall we go through them one by one?
Sure.
Great. Okay, the first one up is innovation is episodic. Now, when I look at this one, I really think that this challenge supports the point that process matters and that innovation must become a tangible part of a company's culture. It's a living thing. We've said this in other webinars. It's a living thing. Would you agree?
I would. What I find today is that everybody's talking about innovation, but when you look at what they're doing, it's actually what I call innovation theater, right? So we get our senior team, we fly them off to Silicon Valley, they get their picture taken next to the Google sign, and that's wonderful and it's so exciting. Or even better, like you and I have been through this, right? We do boot camps and the walls are covered with Post-it notes and people go, oh, that was fabulous. And then we get back to work and nobody knows what's going on. And so the thing that we teach in Leading Strategic Growth and Change, and the thing I teach in my own work, is that innovation is actually a process that you can learn. And it's 3 things. People always confuse it with being just getting the ideas. That's not enough. You've got to do ideation, but then you have to follow that up with incubation, which is taking your idea and turning it into something you can take to market. And then you've got the acceleration process, which is taking your incubated idea, and now it's got to become apparent grown-up. So you know what that's like. Like all of a sudden, you have to make nice to the lawyers and you have to bring in the quality people and legal has to be on board. It's a phase change. And that's oftentimes where innovations get stuck.
Yeah. And so do you think, what percentage of companies do you think are nowadays, compared to 15 years ago, are looking at innovation as an absolute necessity?
Well, there was a recent McKinsey study that found that only 6% of thousands of companies they had in their survey felt that they were getting it right. 6%.
6% getting it right.
Getting it right.
And what percentage do you think are even trying it? Hopefully 100.
More than used to be. I was just part of a big IBM study, and it was called something like The Empire Strikes Back. And it was that, I'd say 15 years ago, people were totally freaked out at these startup disruptors that were going to, change. Now I think companies are starting to get the notion that we can be our own disruptors. We can disrupt ourselves. So it's less scary than it was back then, but I think we're kind of at the awareness stage. We're a long way from a lot of companies knowing exactly what to do.
Right. And if you don't know what innovation is, it's just a word, it's just a buzzword.
It's cool,
It's a cool word to use, and it's a cool word, but I would think if it isn't part of the culture, then it may be debilitating to the people who work for that company, because it looks like, well, what was all that work for?
Exactly. Well, the episodic part is the part that's really dangerous, because you get critical mass. People have the fire in their bellies, they have the scales have fallen from their eyes, and then they run right into this brick wall of the parent company, and it's worse than if you'd done nothing.
Right, and then it just sort of ends. And you think, well,
and you lose all those people.
Yeah,
they'll go somewhere else where their ideas are going to be appreciated.
Exactly. Great. All right, interesting. So let's move on to the next challenge. Our next challenge are resources are trapped and held hostage by incumbent businesses. And this challenge reminds me of one of the phrases that another of our professors says is the most dangerous phrase for a company to believe. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Very dangerous.
Absolutely.
Where it simply is, for a company, less disruptive to just keep existing where you're having current success.
Yeah, there are a lot of reasons why this principle is so important, which is that if you're not able to look across your whole corporate portfolio and see what's coming, you're very likely to keep resources the way that they have been, which is fine as long as everything's stable, but we know things aren't stable these days. And so the heads of these big, important businesses will continue to put resources into those big, important businesses and not move on, right? It's a little bit like, the head of the film business at Kodak being told, oh, well, in the future, chemicals go away, film goes away, it'll all be digital, and it'll all be on a device that isn't even a camera. That person's not going to be inclined to put resources into this new thing. They're going to be inclined to sort of dig the moat and defend, right? And that's totally the wrong response.
And why do you think that? What's the psychology around that? Because, is it just simply, is it apathy? Is it fear? Is it wanting to see if somebody else and then trying to beat? What have you discovered when you ask leaders, why are you not existing outside of your current success, which we know is not sustainable, which we know change happens. We know customers want more. Yesterday's exciters are tomorrow's enragers. We've talked about this for years. So what do you find that they feel about that?
Well, part of it's personal self-interest, to be blunt. The fact that digital is going to be important. If my whole experience and background and history and library are about chemicals, that's going to be scary. So there's fear, there's self-interest. I think the larger question, though, is it always feels like a loss, right? Because the early days of anything, it requires investment, it requires more energy, it requires changing my habits, it requires talking to different people, bringing in different capabilities into the firm. So there's a lot of challenge to doing it properly. Now, the good news is I think once firms get used to working this way, once people get the excitement of being in a company that's continually reinventing itself and finding new territories and able to do new things, that almost becomes addictive, and you get things happening the other way, which your people get excited by it.
Well, that was the psychology of it for people who work within an organization, is that we are not changing past successes because we don't honor them. And I think people feel that way. I was part of this. Is this somehow not worthy anymore? And there is a psychological component.
Oh, there is.
So how do you counteract that?
Oh, I think you have to provide guidance for people as to where they fit in the future. So one of my clients is a company called United Paper Mills, or UPM. Very exciting business. They cut down trees, and they take trees and they make them into paper. And they make the paper that The Economist is printed on, for example. And they split the company some years back into the mature businesses and the growth businesses. And I thought that was a terrible idea. How crazy could you be? How much fun would it be coming to work every day and being told, you're running the mature business, just hand over the cash to these new businesses. And I went and I interviewed the managers, and I thought, oh, these guys are going to be demoralized and upset, and it's not going to be great. I could not have been more wrong. They were like, we are Rambo. We are keeping the wheels turning while those guys get their act together. And their CEO had very insightfully sat them down and said, look, when this thing converts to being this new bio business that they wanted to build, I'm going to need you. I'm going to need your skills at scaling. I'm going to need your skills at operate exactly. I'm going to need your supply chain knowledge. So he had painted a future for them, which made it much less difficult for them to embrace it.
I like that. He painted a future for them. And that is really, I think, what I'm getting at there, is to paint a future for the people. And also, the leader, it's a responsibility of the leader to sort of honor the talent they have to move forward, not to just wipe it out and start from scratch. That constant feeling that people have of, we're going to wipe out the old, bring in new, wipe out them in 5 years. It's like, but to really honor that. That's great. I love it. Okay, shall we move on to number 3? Number 3, you're trying to fit innovation into the structure that you have. So I was laughing, I was thinking about this one because I thought, the term habit, the habits that we have, is most times delineated by good habits and bad habits, right? And we mark those on either side of the fence. But this instance, your theory is that even good habits can obstruct the innovation process.
Oh, totally, yeah. What I see is companies are so concerned about making big changes to their organizational structure that they'll try to, for example, fit a service business into a business that makes products, and it doesn't work. It's a different business model, different metrics, different rhythm, different cash flows. Everything's different, and yet they try to sort of squeeze them in. And when you look at most really innovative ideas, they tend to fall between the cracks of the existing structure. And if you try to force fit them into the existing structure, structure, it's going to be the wrong everything, the wrong measures, the wrong people.
Right.
So what I recommend is something similar to what IBM did back in the days of Lou Gerstner, which was very clever, which was he actually carved out a small team that would figure out what an opportunity could look like. And then he started to pull pieces of the existing business and put them under that team. And so what he rebuilt was a new structure that was suitable to the business that he was trying to get into, rather than something that was like the mainframe business, right? And it was a very clever way of navigating that organizational structural issue.
So it's in sort of an efficient and smaller way of using pieces of what's working well, so those people can continue to work well, continue to do what they've done, but almost not in a furtive way, but just in a way of like sort of pulling them in a way that is sort of adding value, almost unbeknownst.
Yeah. Well, what you're doing is you're creating a structure that makes sense for the new stuff, and you're also weakening, in a good way, the existing structure, so that you're loosening the inertia.
Right. Not just smashing
Exactly.
it. Yeah,
Exactly.
Great. So what would you say would be, that example you gave, what is the first step, if you're trying to, you have a structure, you have a culture, you have a very definite way of running a business and everything. What would you say is the first thing a leader should do in an organization?
Well, if you want to follow the IBM example, the way they got into this was they actually had a terrible, painful experience. So they had the first few years of the turnaround, and that was kind of stabilize the ship. And then it was, okay, now it's time to start to grow again. And what Gerstner was finding was his business unit leaders, because they were under these short-term pressures, were systematically undercutting the budgets and the resources that were dedicated to new things. So he created a separate reporting line that went up through a guy called Ralph, whose last name I've now forgotten, but so he was in charge of the Emerging Business Opportunity Program, and all budgets and all people who were dedicated to that program reported to him, and his sole job was making sure those resources stayed on growth, not on the business as usual. And then what they would do is they would develop a point of view about the future. So as an example, one of the things they looked at was something they called pervasive computing. Today we would think of that as the Internet of Things, but they had this very early idea. And the dynamic was that it had to be big enough to be worthy of IBM. It had to be rich enough that companies would actually devote significant resources to computing power in that area, and it had to be something where they felt they had a right to play. And if it was big enough, then they would take a senior person and put them in charge of that exploration. And then as it gained knowledge, as they got to understand where the opportunity really was, that's when they started to do the reconfiguration.
Well, that's what I like. I like that process. So before because one of our professors says, when a leader spits, it's a waterfall. And so a leader has to be very careful. So in other words, this kind of reconnaissance, or what have you, has been done way before they're starting to pull those resources. Because if you're just pulling resources in the discovery phase, that can be debilitating.
Oh, totally.
So I like this process.
Because it might not work. I mean, the thing people always forget is, yes, innovation's great, but we have this pervasive pro-innovation bias where nothing ever goes wrong. The thing that we're inventing is better than whatever came before. That's just not right. Not all innovations deserve to thrive.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And if that would be like the anathema to what innovation is. If you just think that it's all success, the whole point of innovation is that you fail, learn, recalibrate, try again. So, all right, great. This is interesting. All right, number 4 challenge is too little diversity of thought, too much isolation from customer experience. And this is very interesting to me because I really feel that in this day and age, with such easy access to our customers' current, our customers' potential, it just seems to me that it's unnecessary for us to be sort of making decisions in the dark anymore.
Crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, so talk more about that.
Sure. So one of the things I see with businesses that have been around for a while is they kind of back to habits, right? You get in the habit of not really listening to what's going on with your customers. And this can manifest itself in all kinds of interesting ways. So here's one that caught my eye just from the other day, which was there was an article that was being written about managing the hours of retail workers. And a company that's really making an effort in that regard is The Gap, the clothing store. And this manager for The Gap was being interviewed about why was it so difficult for them to get stable hours for their workers. And he said, oh, well, headquarters makes these decisions about promotions. But even worse than that, he said, I had 2 double shifts running because we were expecting an executive visit. Now let that sink in for a minute. The executive thinks they're doing the right thing. They're going into the field. They're going to see what's going on in the stores. They're going to have earnest conversations with their customers. But the Gap they're visiting is a Gap that has 3 times as much manpower in it as the gap you or I are going to go to, right?
Not
So
the
without
truth,
no, and so without anybody meaning bad by it, meaning with no ill intent, what this store manager is doing is creating a fantasy. And when that manager goes into that store, what they're seeing is not the truth.
Right.
And so I think we fall into these habits of trying to look good internally. We call on the same people, we have the same conversations over and over again, instead of having really diverse representations of people on the committees that decide what programs we're going to go for, and on the design teams, and on the groups that are going to go look for new inspiration. It's very, very easy to get isolated from what the customer is really experiencing.
Exactly.
And I had a client just the other day, a big bank, and for the first time we went and did a customer exploration. And out of that one visit came the insight that the projections they'd been making as to how much people would buy of a certain product were 3 times too optimistic.
Right. Right.
And that's so easy to find out
It's so
that
easy
information.
to find that out, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of like being a mystery shopper and walking in and saying, "I'm the mystery shopper."
Exactly.
It's
Exactly.
like, it's not going to work. You're not going to get the truth of
the New York Times restaurant critic, right? You
Right,
know, like
I mean, with a sign, with
Right.
a label. Or something. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
No, I agree, but I just think there's such easy access, and there's a whole generation of people who are willing to tell you the truth.
Totally.
So you really can learn a lot very easily and cost effectively nowadays.
Well,
It doesn't even have to be.
Right.
You can just get a lot of data.
Well, and as my
Easily.
friend David Rogers, who teaches in our digital strategy programs,
Right.
as you know, would say, every business today is a digital business. Every business is a social business.
Right.
If you're selling hammers on Amazon, I'm sorry, there are reviews on those hammers,
Right.
and you can get other people's opinions.
Yeah, and it really does affect everything. And
Totally
to
does.
ignore it is, there's no excuse.
No.
Really no excuse. Great. All right, let's move on to the last challenge we have here: treating assumptions like knowledge. So, again, when I look at this issue, I think of, again, what comes to mind that while process is enormously important, it must coexist with flexibility, the agility to pivot quickly. So, do you agree?
Yes, that's something we spend a lot of time on in leading strategic growth and change, which is the process of converting assumptions into knowledge. It's just so critical. And human beings, as you and I have over many years talked about, we are terrible at processing assumptions, right? Like we say something and either it becomes a fact in our head immediately and all of a sudden the world revolves around that fact, or we forget them. And so we make a decision, we put investments in something, and then 6 months later come back and we've completely forgotten why we were doing what we thought we were doing. Right. So what we do in discovery-driven planning, which is part of the theme that we pursue in leading strategic growth and change, is we actually teach people to document their assumptions, call them assumptions. Don't call them projections or targets or goals. Call them assumptions, hypotheses, tests, or facts. And then we teach you how to learn your way to what the real opportunity is.
Right. Great. Well, that's interesting. So I think we went through the 5, and I think they kind of break down in a systematic way again. So being systematic, having a very holistic view, not trying to put it into a model that you already have, and then trying to sort of pull from the resources that work and not just focus on that or be afraid to move away from that. What would you say are the 1 or 2 things that anybody who's watching us now, because everybody, when they watch these, they want to know, like, okay, what do I do today and what do I do long term? Like, what can they think today if you're a leader in an organization? What would be the first thing you'd want to think about if you're trying to move your organization into being an innovation excellence?
So I think one of the first observations I would make is that a lot of companies get the message, right? They got the memo, innovation's important. Okay, you, go form a skunk works and do stuff. Right. And that's totally unnecessary today because we have a whole body of knowledge about how to innovate effectively inside a corporation at scale. And we teach it in Leading Strategic Growth and Change. We teach it in Mastering Corporate Entrepreneurship. So my first encouragement would be, if you wanted to try to do anything that was new, whether it's learning to scuba dive or play chess or be a gymnast, you would take lessons. You would get would get educated. And yet somehow when it comes to innovation, people seem to feel, oh no, I've got to take these 3 bright people and put them in a garage somewhere and make fiberglass buildings and have cool slogans on the walls. So my first encouragement would be to get yourself a basic education in what is needed, because what is a fallacy is that innovation is undisciplined. Innovation is incredibly disciplined, but it's a discipline that makes sense given the high levels of uncertainty that you're dealing with. So the first thing I would recommend people do is just get a copy of my book, have a look at our courses, have a look at the websites. Just begin to get smarter. And it's not just me, it's also people like Steve Blank, Alexander Osterwalder, people like that that have really kind of broken down some of the challenges of innovation into manageable chunks. And once you've gotten a little bit of an education, at least now you know what you're trying to accomplish.
Right, right. Great. Well, this has been so interesting. And again, I keep reiterating with a lot of the webinars that we do is that, the fact of the matter is you believe in a process, but you've also worked with so many companies to see realities. So I think the process that you're talking about is also followed by realities. One thing you talk about in Leading Strategic Growth and Change is just general realities of your individual company. That's why there's a personal case in there. Because, again, you're not trying to fit your process into a company. You're trying to give it like a template there for working on this. And I think,
let me spend just a minute on that, because this is something that might be kind of useful for you guys. What we do for every participant in Leading Strategic Growth and Change is they come into the course with a problem, an issue that they want to work on. And we actually ask them to write it down before they come, not so much because we need the document, but because we need the thought process that goes into creating the document. And then throughout a whole week, what you do is you get put into a team with 3 or 4 other people, and each of you works on your case. And then at the end of the course, we sort of come back to it and say, well, okay, how has that progressed? And in just about every case, we've seen massive progress, because you're getting what you don't get at work. Like at work, you're buried in emails and meetings and you're traveling. For LSGC, you're there for a week with other people who have no political axe to grind, right? They're your peers, and you get to actually bounce your ideas off of them. So a lot of times we'll find people came in with the wrong question, or they've really rethought their assumptions, or they've seen an opportunity they never realized was there. And so by the end of the week, it's thrilling to see so much progress on very important strategic questions.
Or they're living with those challenges we've outlined today and not even knowing it.
Right.
The first thing is to get it here that I wasn't even seeing this correctly. But also I think that the great thing about learning this stuff is that you go back and you teach it, and that's the best way to reiterate it. So we're very big on leaders as teachers, as to go back and really. We have a lot of questions coming in.
Great.
So I would love to. We've got about 8 minutes left. I'd love to go through a few of those if you'd like. Okay.
Bring it on.
Great. So from Alexander. You've talked a little bit about this, but I'm sure you've worked with so many companies. You can probably right at the tip of your tongue, and you've probably list 100 of them. But can you give an example of a company that's currently using these principles?
Sure, Alexander, that's a great question. And I'll give you a company that I'm not working with, but I think does exemplify a lot of this, and that's Adobe. And what Adobe did some years ago, much to the consternation of some of their customers, is they went through a complete business model transformation. They went from selling essentially shrink-wrapped software in boxes to selling software that you subscribe to as a service. And it was much more a flow. And among the things they did that I thought were very smart is they really did a good job of articulating to all of their stakeholders what this change would mean for them, and really kind of got ahead of the change happening in their investing community and in their employee community and in their user community. And not everybody was happy, but they eventually managed the transition well. And today they're doing a really innovative thing, which is they have a red box they call a kick box, and it provides an easy entry for people to begin to participate in their innovation program wherever they are in the company. So I think that's something really good to look at and learn about.
Great. So from Dina, what are the roles of leaders in an innovation program?
Oh, Dina, that's a great question, because there are actually 3 roles, and people don't really think about them as different enough. So the first role is you need someone setting the strategy within which innovation takes place. And if that's not clear to people, you have innovations going all over the place, and most of that is going to be a waste of breath, because if it doesn't provide a good strategic fit right from the beginning, then it's not even worth starting. So you need somebody to define that. Then you need somebody to run the ventures, and these are your internal entrepreneurs, your pirates, your radicals, the people that are nonconformists, that don't like to come to your Thursday meeting, that that are going to kind of try to do their own thing. And then in between, you have a role that I call the Sherpa, and a Sherpa's kind of like if you're off to Mount Everest, right? Your Sherpa is going to be the one that tells you, well, if the wind is blowing this way, we should take that trail, or I think the weather forecast is this, so we should leave in the morning. Your organizational Sherpa is typically a person who knows the company very well, has very strong social connections across the company, a lot of social capital, and who can help knit together the venture and the parent company. And so it may be many different people, but those three kinds of roles I've seen be extremely important to the success of a corporate venture.
Okay, so the three roles. The first role is
The executive leadership,
Second role,
the entrepreneur, internal entrepreneur,
yeah.
and then the
The
Sherpa.
cowboy, the cowboy type person who's
Right.
out there, yeah. And then the Sherpa, or what, in show business, a stage manager,
Exactly.
that, type thing, yeah.
Exactly.
Great. All right, let's keep going. From Juan, what got you started researching in this area?
Oh, thank you, Juan, for asking. Well, I started working on this years ago when I was actually involved in IT projects. And IT projects were big organizational change efforts in many cases, not just the technology, but also the organization around them. So that kind of got me interested in large-scale organizational change. And when I came to do my PhD, I did that at the Wharton School, and I was affiliated with the Entrepreneurship Center there, Ian McMillan Center. And he said, well, why don't you think about innovation in a corporation as a large-scale organizational change type? And I got very interested in that, and that really set me off looking at corporate innovation as opposed to individual entrepreneurship as a real focus. And I do some work in entrepreneurship as well. Most of my effort's been spent on the corporate side. And that set us off on a whole set of investigations, which I think the biggest landmark that started it was the publication of Discovery-Driven Planning in 1995. And that has since become deeply embedded in the way a lot of corporate entrepreneurship is taught. It's in entrepreneurship curricula. And I followed that up with a whole series of books and articles and so forth, culminating in this discovery-driven growth moment. And this is probably a good time to come back to the title of this webinar, because I published Discovery-Driven Planning in 1995. Discovery-Driven Growth was 2009. So you're already seeing quite a passage of time. And only now today are we starting to see really widespread recognition that these ideas are critical if you're going to be strategically successful.
Yeah. Great. All right. We have some questions are coming in, a lot. So let's get to another one. From Bjorn, are companies using innovation as a process and a precursor to creating transient advantage? Example, using a systematic approach based on a strategic vision going forward, like a sales force.
Yeah, I think they are. I think what you see in companies that are more forward-looking now is they really understand their portfolios, and they have investments they're making that keep today's business fresh, investments they're making that open up opportunities for tomorrow's business, and then they're very selectively investing in what I call options, which are small bets you place today that could open up a big opportunity in the future. And I think the smarter ones are doing that very systematically and strategically.
Great. So let's see here. What from Terry? I like this question because I think a lot of people are probably going to be asking it out there. How do you determine when to give up on an idea that's not working?
How to disengage,
Yes.
how to shoot the zombies,
Yeah.
those businesses that just give me one more year, just
Yeah,
give me a little
yeah.
more dollar. So I think there are two principles here. The first principle is fall in love with the problem that you're trying to solve. Don't fall in love with one particular solution. So if you think you've got a really clear grasp on what a customer pain point or a customer issue is, you don't need to let that go, to let go things that you're trying that aren't working out. So that's the first principle, right? Don't be afraid to change your methodology, even if your goal remains the same. Second one is you really need to be very honest about, does the potential of this, as we've looked at it, as we've tested our assumptions, as we've kind of rerun our models, is the potential what we once thought? And if it's a couple of months of no, it's not, no, it's not, no, it's not, that's a good time to stop.
Good. Yeah, I think as much as there needs to be a template to begin it, there also needs a template to end it.
Yes.
Because otherwise that's debilitating again to a company as well.
And one of the sessions we talk about is what I call healthy disengagement. I actually run a whole session on just that problem because it's so hard. In companies, it's so hard to get stuff started. By the time you get it started, you don't want to have it stop. Yet you need both. You need to think about
that
both.
session, I've been in it many times, very fruitful. There's a lot of good conversation in that session. All right, let's do one or two more questions. Philippe, could you share with us an example of a company currently using discovery-driven planning at the acceleration stage?
At the acceleration stage?
Yeah.
I can't talk about them publicly because it's a private thing, but yeah, they're actually using it. Now, by the time you get to acceleration, a lot more of the assumptions you're making relate to things that are internal. So, bringing in your lawyers and your compliance people and your HR, and the checkpoints become much more about paths to maturity than they are paths to understanding the market. So you start to bring in a lot of those internal dimensions in the acceleration phase.
Great. This is wonderful. Well, Rita, thank you so much for being with us today. There's many more questions, and as we've been doing in our past webinars recently, we will continue to film after we close out today. Please look for The Conversation Continues, where Rita and I will answer more of your questions. That will also be sent to you along with the webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. Rita, it's been wonderful.
Thanks, Scott.